Hello, gardeners, and welcome to another edition of your Gardening Week. It's great to have you here today. I'm happy to be here today. It is finally summer in the northern hemisphere, and in the southern hemisphere, winter is starting to wane. Every day for you is going to give you a little bit more sun. So I love the winter solstice because I can look forward to the gardening season. So I'm a bit jealous of you in the southern hemisphere. But we're right in the middle of our gardening season. Things are going great, and I've got a lot to talk about today. So join in, ask questions. I'll cover questions from last week. I'm not going to be able to get to everything, but let's see if we can get close to maybe 50 different gardening topics covered today. I think that would be great. Hello, as everybody's checking in. It's great to see a lot of the regulars, Diane, Heidi, Jay. Good to have you all here. And it's so wonderful to have a Monday morning for me, afternoon for some of you, and even evening for others, where we can all get together and just talk about gardening. There's few things that I like more than to just sit and talk about gardening. So great to have you here. Let me jump right into a couple of the conversations that were happening before we went live. There was a question from Art Renke, and thank you, Scott, for facilitating information back and forth. The question was, with his turnips, marigolds, and radishes, they're being eaten by bugs, and they look like little black flies. And he asked the best way to stop it. Well, my first guess was that they were flea beetles, and then I saw that you were looking it up, and you came to that same determination. Flea beetles are one of those insect pests that just come to the garden and tend to stay, and they're very hard to get rid of. You can try neem oil, you can try a good spritz of water to get them off, but they always seem to come back. So here's how I deal with flea beetles for the most part. And I think you've kind of already discovered it just by seeing what they're attacking. They really like the plants that are like turnips and radishes. And I let them eat the turnips and the radishes. This year, they actually attacked my mustard first. And I don't want to put neem oil on my mustard leaves because I'm going to put it in a salad. So I was a little discouraged, but as soon as the radishes and the turnips started growing, all the flea beetles went to start eating those plants. And I'm okay with that because I'm going to be harvesting the root of the turnips and the root of the radishes, and I'm not that concerned about how the leaves work. So when it comes to flea beetles, I just kind of have to accept that they're going to be in the garden. And so I let them eat the leaves of the plants that I don't care about the leaves. That way they're not eating my spinach, they're not eating my lettuce, they're not really devastating any other of the plants I have in the garden. They leave little holes, it's unsightly, but for the most part, I just try to let the flea beetles live. As the predators come in, the predatory insects, those beneficial bugs, they'll gradually start dealing with the flea beetles. Probably by midsummer, they'll be gone. You probably won't see much of them at all. So early in the season, sacrificing the leaves of some of your plants is really not a bad way to deal with the flea beetles. And that keeps them off of some of those other plants that you want to save. So good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning from lots of different people. Baby Root, Jessica, Julie, Daryl, Luciana, Dustin, Karen, Laura. Oh, it's so nice to see everybody here. Kansas City is checking in with James. Good morning, everybody. Let's pop back to the very first question that was asked today by Steve Valk. He was wondering about a hose, a good quality hose. And you could have everything right in your garden, but if you're always struggling with your hose, it's a pain. It takes away from the experience. I always try to buy a professional grade or construction grade hose. And it will say on the packaging whether it's professional grade or construction grade. They tend to be more durable. They don't kink. They're a lot easier to use. The problem is, you're probably not going to find that quality of a hose at a Walmart or even the big box stores. So you may have to go to Ace Hardware. You might have to go to a ranch supply store. You might find a local hardware store that will sell better quality. But pay extra for professional grade or construction grade, and you'll probably be happy in the long run. Okay, let's see what we have popping up here. Diane is saying, hi Gardener Scott, you once mentioned a YouTube gardener that specializes in desert zones. Can you say his name or channel again? I've mentioned Scott Head at the Black Gumbo channel. He's in zone 9A. I believe that's what it is, but he's not in a desert. He's in the U.S. South. I really don't know of anyone that specializes in desert zones other than somebody like Scott who has to deal with that kind of long season with a lot of heat. So check out the Black Gumbo channel, Scott Head, and see if maybe you might get some of the answers you're looking for. The problem is there aren't a lot of channels out there that deal with some of the areas that are really difficult to grow in, like a desert area or like mine, you know. There aren't many YouTube gardeners out there making videos for people that have a very short growing season in the mountains and in dry, arid conditions. It's easy to garden when you get lots of rain and you get a long season, and that tends to be where a lot of the channels come from. So sorry I can't recommend any of those outliers because there really aren't a lot of them. Okay, Gerardo Family is asking a question about fruit trees. I'm actually going to cover that here in just a little bit. Had a lot of questions about fruit trees this week, so that's going to be one of my main topics of discussion. Let's see. Good morning, Sandy. Good to see you. Ralph, good morning to you. Your potatoes are pretty tall. Is it okay to cut them back before harvest? I wouldn't. The vines, the plants from the potatoes, all of the energy of the plant is going into that tuber. And so if you want nice, big, juicy, delicious potatoes, then let the plants grow. At some point, probably not too far from now, they're going to start dying back. And that's the sign that it's getting close to when you're going to harvest your potatoes, is that the vines, the plants will start dying, browning, and then it'll look like they're completely dead. Leave them on. You want all of that energy going to the potato. There's really no reason to prune the potatoes unless they're interfering with some other plant that you consider to be more important. Diane is saying, critters got to my tomato and pepper plants one day before I planned on putting up a barrier. Figures. Isn't that the way it always happens? I had every intention this year of putting up some row covers and doing more protection on my plants. I didn't, and now I'm seeing some of the repercussions. Like flea beetles, you can actually put row covers over your radishes and your root crops to keep away insects, and they can be pretty effective at flea beetles, but the flea beetles are so small, they tend to find the smallest crevice. This goes to show yet again that if you plan to do something and want to do something to deal with a problem in your garden, it's always best to do it now rather than waiting for tomorrow. And I do that so often where I'm going to do something tomorrow and tomorrow's always too late. Okay, let's get into a question from last week. Sushma had asked, how to improve the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium levels naturally in a garden bed. So naturally is a relative term. For me, that means adding compost and organic material, because as the compost and organic material continues to decompose in the soil, it will add levels of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and lots of other micronutrients. So putting organic material back into the soil is the best natural way to add nutrients to the soil. If I have brand new soil, particularly a potting soil, and I want to try to get those nutrients added, I'll add blood meal for the nitrogen, I'll add bone meal for the phosphorus, and I'll add green sand for the potassium. I don't always do that in my big open beds because I'm adding the organic matter. But in smaller quantities, those are the three things that I typically like to use. Okay, Projection 100 had asked, I see that you're going to discuss growing strawberries. Could you touch on how to propagate from runners? So I did talk about strawberries last week, but I didn't talk about propagating them from the runners. And yesterday, this is another one of those do it today, but yesterday I noticed that my strawberries were sending out runners, and I thought, oh, I need to start propagating those. I'll do it later next week. Well, I think I'm motivated now. Maybe I'll do it today. There's a couple different ways you can do it. So a strawberry plant will send out a runner, and it's a long, thin stem, and at the tip of that stem, a new plant is going to grow. And it's essentially a clone of the mother plant. You can just let it rest on soil, and it will root and grow into a new plant. And then to propagate it, you can dig up that plant. The roots won't be that deep, and so it's real easy to repot or move to another area. You do need to cut the runner. Especially if you let it root, it's very common that the runner will keep going and give you another daughter plant and then another. I've had some runners that have given me 4 or 5 plants if I just let them go. If I want to start strawberries in a completely new bed and really expand a new area, I'll take little pots or little yogurt cups, fill them with potting soil, and then as the runner starts growing, I'll take that little plant before it roots, I'll kind of direct the stem so that that plant rests on top of that little pot or that little yogurt cup, and then taking a garden staple, I'll just anchor the runner in that pot. Now it'll root, but instead of rooting in the soil near the mother plant, now it's rooting into a little pot. I give it a month or so it gets nice and big size with good root development. Then I'll cut the runner and repot it in another area. And I've done this again in succession, where the same runner, I'll have 3 of these little pots side by side to propagate the strawberry plants. So very easy to propagate. Dig it up or just direct it into a little pot, and it goes very well. I think I'm going to do the pot method just because I want to move some of these strawberries to new areas, and that tends to be a good way to do it. Okay, Myra Sharp is asking, my neighbor has donkeys. They put out donkey manure. Is donkey manure safe to use? Do I also need to wait 6 months before using it? Yeah, I would treat donkey manure pretty much like you treat horse manure. I'm assuming that they're eating hay or alfalfa. The one concern I would have is just what they're eating, and if there's any chemicals that might be on their feed, or if they have salt licks and there's a lot of salt going into their manure. But otherwise, just think of it like it's horse manure. And yes, you should age it for at least 6 months so you don't have any risk of E. coli, so you don't have an excess of ammonia because the manure is fresh and hot, and then use that aged manure in your garden. I like to use aged manure in my compost pile, but it can also be great mixed with wood chips. It'll help the wood chips break down a little bit faster if you've got an area where you're using a thick layer of wood chips as a mulch. So yeah, go with the donkey manure. Okay, Diane says, I have little strawberries and runners everywhere on my property. I gathered these are different. Yeah, those might be alpine or a wild strawberry that's in your area. It's hard to say. I know that there are some areas here in Colorado near streams up in the mountains. There will be fields of the wild strawberries. It's different because it's a different plant. The fruit is usually much smaller, but often packed with flavor. But the process can be basically the same. You can dig them up, pot them, and then move them later, or direct those runners into little pots. I'm guessing a lot of the plants you have don't have long runners. A lot of those wild varieties have pretty short runners. But the process is basically the same. It's just a different plant, and whether the plant is big enough for you to pot it up, or whether you have to dig it up if you want to move it to another area. Have you eaten them? If you have tried those strawberries and you like the flavor and you want to propagate and move them to a bed to grow on purpose, I say go for it. Okay, let's move to another question. Now we'll get into the fruit trees, because Myra Sharp was asking from last week. I would like to plant a few fruit trees. Where do you get your dormant trees? I saw your video on how you order them online. So I talked a little bit about the fruit trees in those couple videos that I put together. In years past, I've ordered a lot of my trees from Stark Brothers. Sorry to say that this year I just didn't like the quality that I got. The packing wasn't up to my standards, and the trees and the fruit bushes I ordered were a little bit smaller than I've received in the past. But I got great results from Fedco. So Fedco is a nursery in Maine. All of their trees came in great shape, bigger than I've ever gotten from another company. They're all growing great right now. They look wonderful. And they were packed exactly the way I expected them to be packed and shipped. So right now, my best recommendation would be to order your bare root dormant trees from Fedco. Now, the issue when it comes to fruit trees in general is that they're going to be shipped as bare root or dormant trees in spring. And so it might be a little bit late for those of us in the United States to be ordering bare root or dormant trees. I did do that last year and put in a bare root tree in, I think it was September, because fall planting really does work well. I prefer fall planting trees over spring planting trees. But we kind of had an early winter, so the tree wasn't very well established going into the winter. And then coming out of the winter, we had some extremely cold weather just about the time that the trees were going to start growing and budding. So that's the one tree that didn't make it in my garden this year. It didn't survive. And I think that was partly because I planted a dormant / bare root tree in early fall. So spring is really the best time to do that. If you want to do fall planting, which I do highly recommend, I encourage that you go to a local nursery and buy a potted tree. It's already going to be leafed out. It's already going to be actively growing. You could put it in your garden in late summer or early fall, and it should have ample time for the roots to develop. That's one of the nice things about the fall planting, is the roots will continue to grow and spread and develop that really nice foundation in fall, even after the leaves have fallen. The roots will stay viable in the soil until the soil freezes. So for dormant trees, I recommend ordering your trees like in January, because a lot will sell out pretty fast. Putting them in the ground as soon as the soil can be worked, as soon as they're shipped to you in spring. But if you want to do fall planting, go with a live tree. That tends to work best. Okay. Fuzzy, do you ever just grow some fruit trees from seed for fun? I have done that in the past. I haven't done that recently. It is just for fun. I think it's a great exercise, especially for kids, to plant a seed from some fruit you ate and see it grow. It takes a long time. A lot of those fruit trees that we are planting in our garden are already 2 or 3 or 4 years old by the time we put them in, and then it's going to take another 3 or 4, 5 years before we get any fruit. So if you do want to start fruit trees from seed, you're talking about a long-term investment in your time and space. And that's one reason why I don't do it. It's just because I know it's going to be many years, and especially with trees like apples, the seeds are not going to bear true. Every apple tree seed is a hybrid seed. So if you plant it, who knows what kind of tree you're going to get. But go for it. It's a fun exercise, something to try. Okay, Paula Edens from last week had asked, I have a Cherokee purple tomato plant that is dropping its flowers. What am I doing wrong? Joanne also asked this question. There were a number of comments about tomatoes and plants dropping their flowers, to include fruit trees dropping flowers and pepper plants dropping flowers. So I want to talk a little bit about the weather today, because weather is often the reason why your plants are dropping their flowers, especially something like a tomato. So tomatoes grow ideally when the nighttime temperatures are between 55 and 70 degrees, and the daytime temperatures are between 70 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. That's ideal for tomatoes. When it starts getting outside that range, well, the plant doesn't like it. So, when the daytime temperatures start rising above 85 degrees, the plant starts getting stressed. And especially above 90 degrees, you can expect blossoms to fall off. Even if the blossoms stay on, they probably won't be pollinated. If the nighttime temperatures start regularly dropping below 55 and then 50 degrees as a low, the same thing's going to happen. The flowers aren't going to pollinate and they're going to fall off. So weather plays a very important factor in our garden. If you're trying to grow the plants like tomatoes in your garden and you live in the United States Southwest where it's already 100 degrees every day, well, then you're going to have flowers dropping off. And even for me, when I have a relatively moderate climate, we have days that have already reached into the 90s and the mid-90s, and more are coming. So look at the weather conditions. When your plants start browning, when they start wilting, if they start dying, if the flowers start dropping off, look back a day or two, or back a week, and see if you've noticed some drastic changes in your weather, especially during the summer when it gets hot, because that could be the reason why your plants aren't pollinating and why the flowers just don't seem to be growing the way they're supposed to be growing. It's often weather related. If you discount the weather idea, yeah, now you can look at it as potentially a pest issue or a watering issue, but add this to your list of things to track. If you don't have a garden journal, I suggest you get one. Get a garden journal and keep track of the daily temperature swings. And then if you notice a few days later another trend in the way that the plants are reacting, you can definitely realize that there's a correlation between the weather and how your garden is reacting. Myra, thank you so much for that super chat. Thank you for answering my questions. You're my favorite gardener. Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I just keep saying it enough, or I can't keep saying it enough, that I just love doing this. So I'm so glad that all of you are appreciating me and the time that we have to spend together, along with all the videos and everything else that the Gardener Scott channel is standing for, to keep gardeners growing and to keep gardeners becoming better gardeners. So thank you so much for that. Mrs. Marvel is saying highs are at 104 degrees and I'm still picking tomatoes each day. Shading is very important. And that's a good aspect of this. Once the flowers have set fruit, then it can get above that 90 degrees. And then, yeah, you should try to shade plants like tomatoes in extreme heat, because the fruit will continue to develop after it's been pollinated. It can get sunburn, and it can be affected by those high temperatures. The key is to try to figure out for you when the best time to grow your tomatoes will be, so that they're pollinated and the fruit will start developing when the temperatures are moderate. And then if it gets extremely hot, the fruit will continue to grow. So thank you for pointing that out. That's actually a really good issue when it comes to growing things like tomatoes. And Jennifer says, happy Father's Day a day late. Thank you so much. Had a great Father's Day yesterday. I hope you fathers out there had a great day as well. Yesterday was my son's first Father's Day. And that was the best part of my Father's Day, was actually seeing my son and how much he was enjoying Father's Day for the very first time. So thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. Let's get to another question. This one actually comes from Heidi Clark last week. And so Heidi had asked, I need to grow asparagus. I have never grown asparagus. When do I order asparagus roots? And so I think I talked about this a few weeks back. But asparagus roots will typically come dormant. And you put them in the ground in early spring as soon as the soil can be worked. So you need to order them far enough in advance that you'll have them shipped to you in early spring at an appropriate time. For me, just like the fruit trees, I try to do all my ordering of what I know I'm going to grow in January and early February. This year in particular, I had a lot of feedback from people after I made my asparagus video that they couldn't find asparagus. It was sold out. If you wait too long with any of these plants that you order in the winter, it's not unlikely for them to be sold out by the time you want to use them. So I think the best time to order asparagus is in January. It's probably not going to be shipped to you until March, maybe even April. But at least you've got your order in, at least you know you're going to get it. And as I said in my video last night where I highlighted my asparagus, I ordered 25 asparagus roots and every single one of them sprouted and grew. And I ordered them from Fedco. I was very pleased with the quality of the asparagus roots. So I would recommend Fedco ordering in January and get your asparagus bed growing for next year. Get it set up this year. You probably already know that, Heidi, but get your bed started this year. Get that soil nice and enriched and ready to go for the asparagus. That's what I did, and they're just doing extremely well at this point. Okay. Let's see if we have any other questions that are popping up. Richard W. just harvested garlic scapes. And I'm actually going to cover that in a question again as well, because my garlic scapes are actually doing very well right now. And I was thinking about harvesting yesterday, but I think I'm going to do it tomorrow and fix them in a nice little saute. So garlic scapes are just a wonderful thing. Okay, question from last week, C.R. Menino. What about contractors' leaf compost for my vegetable bed? Should I be concerned what the source really is? Yes. And this holds true with any public sourced material that you're using in your garden. There are many communities that have free compost or free mulch or free leaf mold or free leaf compost. Sometimes they'll charge, but it's available for you to go and pick up and add to your garden. I do recommend that you be careful about the source, because a lot of these community centers will allow people to just drop off any material, and then they make it into compost or they make it into mulch, and then you can come and pick it up. And I've talked a little bit about this recently as well. There are many herbicides out there. 2,4-D has been known to remain viable in the soil for as long as 12 months. And that's a very common herbicide. So if the mulch or the compost is being made from materials that the average person can donate, you don't know if they've been spraying herbicides on their plants or if they've been putting a particular pesticide. And now it's taken to the community center, turned into compost or mulch, and you pick it up and take it to your garden. You could be introducing some harmful chemicals to your garden if you don't know the source. So always ask that question. Often, you might find out that it's an organic operation and they only accept contributions that haven't been treated. So in those cases, by all means, use the material and don't be too concerned. But if you don't know the source and the person that's selling or giving it away doesn't know the source, I would suggest maybe you find a different option. Okay. Shane Lutz is saying, my garden looks healthy. Also, my containers are on pallets. Do the pallet jacks attract bugs? I haven't encountered that problem. I don't think that the pallets are going to attract any insects more than any other wood. A lot of times the pallets are made with hardwoods, and hardwoods are typically relatively resistant to insects. If it is an international pallet, and these are pallets that have a stamp on them, and you can look up online if you see this stamp and there will be coded letters and numbers in there. Those pallets have actually been treated with chemicals so that they won't attract any insects, and any insects that attempt to eat those pallets will die. So be careful about using some of those pallets in your garden because they may still have some of that chemical residue in them and could adversely affect some insects. But as far as attracting or housing insects, I wouldn't be too concerned about the pallets that you might be using in your beds. So interesting question. Okay, Jennifer's asking, I have a very old fig tree that has been neglected. It's still doing well, but it's wild. When should I trim it back? In the fall? Figs give a lot of different options. So because it's a fruit tree, it really depends on what you're trying to get from the pruning. And so with most fruit trees, it's best to prune when they're dormant. In winter or early spring typically. That way you can shape the tree, and when they reemerge and send out the buds, they tend to develop new branches. You can prune during the active growing season, even fig trees, but when you prune fruit trees while they're actively growing, instead of sending out a lot of new branches, they'll send out a lot of new leaves. And so to get a bushy plant, go ahead and prune it when it's actively growing. To get a well-shaped plant, if that's what you're after, with new branches that you can form and grow the plant into the shape you're looking for, it's usually best to do that during a dormant season. Okay, let's get to another question. I told you I wanted to see how many questions we can get through this week. Turks 8806, how often do you water your garden during a dry spell in the weather? I will usually water twice a day, sometimes 3 times a day. A week or so ago, we had a week where the temperatures were 90 degrees and above, which is extremely hot for my region, especially in early June. And the humidity levels were in the single digits. And it was windy. So it was dry, it was windy, and it was hot. And most of my plants were still relatively small. Even the bigger ones that I had transplanted hadn't yet taken off because they were new transplants. So I was watering in the morning. I would go out in the afternoon to check. And if the soil was starting to dry, and often the soil was drying already down to half an inch from the surface in the middle of the day, I'd water again at midday, and then in evening I'd water again. Now this works for me in a dry area because you've probably heard that you shouldn't water in the evening because it can cause fungus or mold to develop on your plants. Well, that's true if you're in a very humid environment and the area stays wet, you could have some fungal problems. But for me, with the dry, hot wind, I would water in the evening and then come back in the morning, and the morning soil was already starting to dry out. So the key is test your soil moisture level. If it's dry or going to be dry very soon, then you probably need to water. And that may mean 2 or 3 times a day, depending on what your weather conditions are. Okay. Let's see if we got any more questions that are popping up. Liliette says, should new fruit trees be pruned and when? I have a video on that. Go ahead and check out my video where I show pruning the brand new fruit trees. And I explain the reasons for it, the different shapes. So yes, new fruit trees should be pruned. The key is what kind of shape you want the tree to turn into, and when you're planting the tree. So I pruned my trees right after planting because I was planting dormant trees and I was looking for new branches to develop. If you're going to do a fall planting where the tree is already growing and actively leafed out, I wouldn't prune a fruit tree like that in the fall. I would go ahead and wait until it was established, and then winter comes, and then in late winter I would prune a brand new fruit tree that had been potted when I transplanted it. So, good question. Thanks. Hi, Raymond from Indonesia. Good to see you here. I think I might have one of your questions I'm going to cover in a little bit. We'll see. I know you're always asking. I so much appreciate how interested you are in gardening, all of you, all the great questions that are coming in. I think that's wonderful. MH is saying, when you are doing a live stream, can you link videos like you can when you upload them? That's a good point. So about 2 days after I finish the live stream, I'll put the timestamps so that you can go to the timestamp of that particular topic if you don't want to watch the entire video or if there's just a certain interest area. I can do the same thing in the description. So it may take me a day or two, but that's a good point. Thank you for bringing that up. I'll plan in the future to go ahead and add links to the videos that I might comment about during the live stream when I'm answering the questions. So it may take a day or two, but yes, go ahead and check on the description at some point in the future. If you haven't found the video in my library, I'll go ahead and start adding that to the description in the live streams. Thank you. That's a good suggestion. Jeff Ferris is asking, thoughts on planting asparagus crowns now? Is it too late? Can they be started in summer or fall? Can viable crowns be found now? So let's go to that last question first. You probably are not going to find viable crowns now. So like I said when I was answering Heidi's question, you really need to order early in the year because the asparagus crowns sell out pretty quickly from the nurseries that I've ordered from. I would say that the middle of summer, yeah, it's probably a bit late. Asparagus is a relatively tender plant. They grow during the cool conditions of spring, and so to sprout right up when they're at the height of summer, they would probably grow, but they probably wouldn't grow as well as if you just waited till next spring and put them in. So if you want to grow asparagus, instead of growing them now, probably since you can't find them, go ahead and get your bed ready to go, get it all prepared for them, order in winter, and then put them in as soon as you can in early spring. That's probably the best way to do it. Diane is saying, I amended my garden this year with compost. Should I use fertilizer this growing season? I usually do. As the compost decomposes, there is going to be some nitrogen deprivation in the soil. Once it has decomposed, that nitrogen is released back as a nutrient. But depending on how new or old that compost is and how far along it is in the decomposition process, it's probably going to take some nitrogen away from the plant. So when I add compost to a bed, I'll typically fertilize that year in particular with that extra nitrogen, just so that plants have the nitrogen, and there's also nitrogen in the soil to benefit the compost as well. After a couple years, you really don't need to do that because of all the nutrients that are naturally present in the soil. So 3 or 4 years, if you're regularly amending, no, you don't really need to add much fertilizer after that point. But new bed, new compost, yeah, I add fertilizer. So thanks for that question. Jilly G, how do you know when you have watered enough? Is there an amount of time you should water each plant each time you water? It gets back to the soil. It depends. The key is that you should want to have your soil as evenly moist as possible. And the key is moist, not wet, not dry. And so on a typical day for me, I'll water a bed and it takes 30 seconds. And I use my water wand with my waterfall head, and a lot of water comes out at a very soft stream. It ends up giving about ½ an inch of water across the surface. It drains through the mulch, drains into the soil, and that's enough. But on some of these really hot days, even when I'm watering 2 or 3 times, I might have to spend a whole minute on a bed, which for me is a long time. That's a lot of water because it's hot, it's dry, it's evaporating. So it depends. Physically check your soil. Actually go to like one corner or to an edge or even the middle of the bed is better and dig a little hole. So dig that little hole put your finger in it and see how moist your soil is. If it's slightly moist and evenly moist, go ahead and do a light watering just to keep it moist. And that may only be 15 or 30 seconds, depending on what kind of watering you're using. If you do that test and you find that it's mostly dry, then you're going to have to extend the amount of time that you water. And so in my garden, when I'm really concerned about the soil moisture levels, I'll start at one bed, move to another, and I have 6 raised beds growing in an area that's pretty close to each other. By the time I get the 6th bed, I'll go back to the first bed and I'll check the soil moisture level there too, just to see if what I gave it, now that it's had a few minutes to seep in, was enough. If you go back that second time after a few minutes and the water level appears fine, now you know that the quantity of water and the amount of time was appropriate. If it's too wet, now you've learned something. The next time you water, water less. If it's still too dry, then water more. So there really isn't a hip pocket suggestion that this is always the way to do it. It depends on your weather, it depends on your soil, it depends on how you water, but you're really going to have to physically get in there and check it to get the best results. Okay, let's pop into some lightning round questions. I think most of these actually came from last week. There might be a couple from the week before, but let's see how fast we can get through these 15 questions with some answers. Kathleen had asked, any advice why my basil's not taking off in zone 8A? It's outside. This is another weather issue. Basil is typically very slow to start. The basil seeds that I started outside, probably a month ago now, are just barely a 1/4 inch high. They just seem to take forever to germinate outside. They do much better inside under the nice controlled conditions. They can be hard outside. It just takes a long time. And then once they start growing, they also tend to hit like a plateau where they don't grow anymore. And then when they get exposed to the really hot conditions, don't be surprised if they bolt and send up their flowers. So basil can be difficult to grow outside, particularly during the heat of summer, and it's usually a weather-related phenomenon. Felicia Carter, I'm having trouble with grasshoppers. It's starting to be a problem. What can I do to keep them from eating my leaves? You can do things like apply neem oil or another pesticide that's focused for caterpillars, and there are some bacterial pesticides that are specifically for the grasshoppers. But what I do is try to attract the birds. Just the other day, I saw a nice robin bouncing around my garden with a grasshopper in its mouth. So grasshoppers are the favorite food of a lot of birds, especially during the growing season. So that's my control, is I just attract the birds, and the birds will take care of the grasshoppers. And I occasionally have an infestation. Usually it's followed by an increase in the birds. So there are some chemicals you can use. There are some both organic and synthetic options. But for me, it's just creating that biosphere that includes the birds, and they'll help take care of the grasshoppers. Lori Anderson, my peppers have been destroyed by slugs. So far, beer has been my best solution. Any other ideas? I've talked about this before. It's really easy with slugs. Take some newspaper and roll it up, wet it, and stick it in the garden. Or take some cardboard and wet it and put it in the paths around your bed. And then when you go out the next morning, you'll probably find slugs underneath the cardboard. And you'll probably find slugs inside the rolled tube of newspaper. Then you just throw them away. So trapping is often the easiest way to deal with slugs. Newspaper and cardboard are among the easiest of those options. Chicken wire, I had some store-bought garlic start sprouting and I didn't want to throw it away, so I threw it in the garden this spring. What do I do with that? So my good garden buddy Jason grows green garlic. And what that means is pretty much what you just did. He'll plant the garlic cloves in spring. They'll start growing, and then he'll harvest them in summer. They won't grow into the big garlic head that you're used to. It'll look more like an onion, but you can use them in your kitchen. They're much closer to chives than they are to garlic, so it's kind of a garlic flavored chive. And so cut them up and use them in sauces. You can add them to salads. You can saute them with whatever you might use garlic in. It's a much more mellow garlic flavor, but definitely consider that. Growing garlic in one season and use it kind of like you would an onion. Veronica Ramirez, as peppers continue to grow and where I see their flowers, where do I trim to increase production and bushiness? So if you look closely at most peppers, between the stem and the leaves, you'll probably see a very small leaf beginning to grow. So if you prune off the tip of pepper plants or the tip of a growing branch of pepper plants just above the junction of the leaves, well, then those two little buds will start growing and they'll start sending up some new stems which will flower and give you more fruit. So the best way to get a bushy pepper plant is to actually cut the top off and let some of those side branches grow. Then you can do the same thing with some of those side branches where you cut the tips off and they'll send out more side branches. So just keep cutting the tips off of pepper plants to get it as bushy as you want. You will be sacrificing some flowers, and early in the season is the best time to pinch or cut off the tips. If you wait until the flowers develop, you might have to sacrifice some of those flowers to get bushiness, but that's how you do it. You just prune off the tips. Gerald St. Augustine, I have an eggplant that has more than 6 fruits. Should I cut off some of the fruits or should I just let all the fruits grow? This is one of those dilemmas that gardeners face every year. I have a pretty short growing season, so if I get 6 eggplant fruits, I'm happy, and I'll usually let all 6 grow because I'm usually not that lucky. If you want bigger fruit, then you should prune off some of the smaller and maybe leave 2 or 3 on the plant and they'll get bigger. If you start pruning off some of those smaller ones, it will probably also stimulate the plant to send out more flowers for more fruit. So in the long run, pruning off some of the smaller ones will give you bigger fruit and it should give you more fruit. Where I live, I can't get away with that. The season isn't long enough for the plant to give me that second growth. But if you have an area that you have a longer season, yeah, definitely consider pruning off some of the eggplant fruit. Same holds true with a lot of squashes, and it'll give you more fruit in the long run. Marianne Brown, I have red acidic soil in Wyoming. Can you give me any advice on growing trees and shrubs? I told you I was going to talk a lot about trees today. So if we're growing in a bed in a vegetable garden, we can amend the soil. We can use compost. We can do all the fertilizers, whatever we need to get our plants growing. But in open areas for trees and shrubs, it's not that easy. And we usually just have to accept whatever our soil is because it can be very expensive and difficult to amend an entire field where you're going to be growing trees. And you really need to do that before you put the trees and the bushes in. So really, if you know your soil is bad to start with, if it's acidic or if it's alkaline, depending on where you live, you should try to select a variety that is known to do better in that type of soil. So in Wyoming, if you've got acidic soil, you should be trying to focus your attention on plants that can handle acidic conditions. So you're asking about trees and shrubs. Well, there's a lot of fruiting shrubs that love acidic soil. A lot of the berries. So look into growing berries in acidic soil, and you'll probably find many varieties that will give you great opportunities. I just can't say that there's some magic you can do to improve your soil. Do use a nice thick organic mulch like wood chips, and eventually that will help moderate some of the pH conditions. But in the beginning, the best case is just to choose the right kind of plant. Scott Meckley, would you explain in detail the proper time method to do pruning and start cuttings from a currant? Thanks. And I understand if you have to wait until next year. So the answer to this question, Scott, is I'm going to wait until next year. I am planning to do a video on my currants and to talk about the new wood and the old wood and the pruning and the bushiness and cuttings and all of that. But it's going to be a lengthy process. So the video is going to take a long time to produce. I've already started doing some of the filming of my currants at their state right now. And then moving later in the season, I'll move into some of those other areas. So yes, that video is coming, but probably not until next year. Sushma Golamudi, how do you provide nitrogen naturally for green vegetables? So I talked a little bit about this when I was mentioning some of the natural amendments that I put into my soil. But as to the nitrogen component, I make my comfrey tea, my tea out of comfrey, and that adds some nitrogen to it. I'll use blood meal as a surface amendment that I work into the soil a little bit to do the nitrogen. And then worm castings. Worm castings or worm tea can also give you some of that nitrogen. Olivia Upel, what can you do to help keep deer and pest animals out of the garden without a fence? Not much. I have a video about deer-proofing your garden, and the only way to deer-proof your garden is with a barrier, with a fence. Now, you can try to choose your plants that are deer-resistant. You can try to put other plants that are known to discourage deer, but they'll eat anything. If they're hungry enough and starving, they will eat anything. So there's really no way to get rid of the deer unless you put a fence up. I hate to say that. Arena Kim, can I grow seedlings under a floating cover without putting a structure for the cover and just lay it on top of the seeded soil? Absolutely. You see this a lot in commercial growing, where they will have fields with rows and rows of the row covers that are just mechanically pulled across the row and then weighted down on the sides, usually with soil, and then the plants will grow underneath it. So definitely you can do that. As soon as the plants start growing and they get, an inch or two tall, you're probably going to have to take the cover off. But you can definitely put covers over your plants without a hoop or some other structure. Luciano Cordova, I'm having a hard time sowing hot peppers. How do you recommend sowing pepper seeds? For me, again, my season is short. There's no way I can sow pepper seeds outside. Even if you have a long growing season, I don't encourage you to try to sow your pepper seeds outside. This year, the hot pepper seeds that I germinated took 4 to 5 weeks to germinate, and that was inside in a nice warm environment with continual moist soil. Still took 4 to 5 weeks. Outside, to have a nice steady moist soil consistently for 4 to 5 weeks can be very difficult to maintain. So it can be very hard to sow seeds outside. So my top recommendation, regardless of where you live, even if you do have a long growing season, start your pepper seeds indoors. You'll get better germination and you should get better results. Waskopi, should I cut off the garlic scapes if I want bigger bulbs? I told you I was going to talk about garlic scapes. So yes, a garlic scape comes on a hard neck garlic variety. If you're growing a soft neck garlic, you're not going to see these. But with hard neck garlic, it's going to send up, it starts off as a curly Q stem at the top. That is actually the flowers that will develop on that garlic plant. And as the plant gets older, that little curly Q is going to straighten up. And so that's the garlic scape. And eventually it will be growing vertically. At the tip of that is where the flowers will emerge and then ultimately the seeds. And yes, garlic does grow flowers and seeds. As with any plant, if it's allowed to flower, it's going to be taking energy away from the root. The root and the plant will be directing all that energy into the flower and the seed development. So to stop that from happening in garlic, cut off your garlic scapes. Now that energy is not going towards the flowers, that energy will stay within the bulb, the root section, and you should get bigger bulbs as a result. And that's why I said I'm planning on cutting off my scapes and eating them soon, because probably about a month away from harvest, this is the time that those bulbs are really going to start growing big. Get rid of the scapes now. Arena Kim, is it safe to use my pulled, dried quackgrass rhizomes as mulch? Yes, but be careful. So anytime you're using rhizomes of any type of plant in your compost or as a mulch, I definitely say wait until they're dried out, wait until there's very little likelihood that they're going to regrow, then you can use them. And actually using them as a mulch is probably a better idea than using them as a compost, because on the surface they'll still be exposed to sunny, hot, dry conditions, and they're less likely to sprout. So even with quackgrass, you can use them as a mulch. Just make sure that the plant is indeed dry and dead before you do that. Okay, Heidi is saying, I already started and planted my seeds, but for next year, what is the best way to control humidity in my spare bedroom where I start my seeds? So I'm not sure if you're too hot or too dry, or not too hot, too wet or too dry as far as your humidity is concerned. I have a too dry area in my grow area, my grow room downstairs. And so I've done things like taking a tray, a potting tray, and filling it with water just to help increase the humidity in that room. If you have the opposite problem, you may actually have to get a dehumidifier. I know people here in Colorado that use humidifiers to get the humidity up. But I find if I've got a lot of trays close together, if I'm keeping the soil moist, and if I know the humidity is dropping in the house, I add a tray or two of water. It tends to do okay for me, keeping the humidity level up. So consider looking into something like that. Is it a hygrometer? I actually bought one, and I haven't put it in my grow area yet, but I actually bought a gauge to tell me what my humidity levels are, and I'm planning to use that next year. So consider getting one of those instruments with a digital readout to tell you, excuse me, to tell you what your humidity is, and that might give you some ideas as to whether it's okay, or you need more, or you need less. Gerald St. Augustine, I build 3 8x4 beds, and it seems all my time is used up by just maintaining the plants. I want more beds, but how can I get more time? That's a good question. And I think I've got a question I was going to pop to here in just a little bit where I talk about that. And that is plan and build off season. And so you might have seen, if you've been following my videos for a while, that I was building beds in late winter and early spring before the plants were even getting close to being put in the ground. I planned them many months ago, but I waited until I had the time. And during the middle of the growing season, gardeners just don't have the time. So wait until you have time. I know you want more, and you probably want them now, but your garden may suffer if you devote a lot of attention to other aspects. And I'm seeing that right now. I have beds that I want to be building right now, and I spent a lot of time in the last couple of weeks building some new beds and filling some new beds, and the plants suffered. Some of the plants that I should have harvested didn't get harvested because I was spending all day building and moving soil and getting the new beds ready to go. So you can determine the balance. Let some things suffer so that you can add more beds, or maybe just have some patience and build the beds when you've got the time to add them to your system. Okay, Diane says, Gardener Scott, we have a cherry tree in our yard that grew out of control. The trunk is now huge and it is peeling and curling. Any advice? It's actually not unusual for cherry trees to peel and curl. So Don't be concerned about it. Go ahead and do a quick search online for what variety of cherry you're growing, and you'll probably see pictures with the curled bark. If it looks like it's more than just the exterior part of the bark that's curling, uh, then you might have to get into some other corrective actions, which is very rare and remote. I'm not even going to talk about it. It's typically just the outer layers of the bark that are peeling. It's an aesthetic thing. It often just doesn't look good, but usually the trunk and the tree is still pretty good. Go ahead and prune back by about a third. That may take some of the stress off the tree, and it may also encourage the bark to stop peeling. But check your particular variety and see if maybe it's perfectly normal. If not, then you can look into other corrective measures. Okay, let's get another question from last week. This is what I'm calling the question of the week because it came from a lot of different people. Russell Radwanski, bit of a strange question, but how did you get into gardening, Scott? And Joanne Beaton, I was wondering that as well. How did you get into gardening? And Mark Goodsmith was asking about what my training background is. So I've always kind of been interested in gardening, probably like a lot of you. You kind of thought you had an interest in it and you kind of got involved a little bit. And that's the way I did it. I was in the Air Force and I had a garden in Montana and I had a garden in Oklahoma and I had a garden in California. And here in Colorado we moved and I had a garden as well. But I really didn't know much about what I was doing. I was just like a new gardener anywhere, or I just dug up some dirt and put some seeds in and grew some plants. And I had some success and I had a lot of failures and I enjoyed the process. And then when I retired from the Air Force back in 2003, I began looking at what I wanted to do for fun and new things in retirement. And I discovered the Master Gardener program here in the United States. And so in 2004, I became a Master Gardener, Colorado Master Gardener, after having gone through the course that the Colorado State University had taught. And that's how I really got into gardening. And one of the aspects of the Master Gardener program is you have to give back to the community through volunteer hours. And so my volunteer hours were spent teaching classes for the Extension Service on gardening. And I taught many, many classes for the Master Gardener program and for Extension, and I spoke at gardening clubs, and I really found out that I liked doing this. And then I really found out that I didn't know what I was doing even after being trained. So I really started expanding my gardens, growing more and more, trying new things. And then I came out of retirement to be the head gardener for a school garden program. Very large operation, 101 raised beds, a 42-foot dome greenhouse, 26,000 square feet of growing space. And that really forced me to become an expert gardener because I was teaching kids and I had to learn how to grow in a very large space, growing food for the school and food for the school district, which meant I didn't have a lot of leeway to screw up. So there's my background. Just started as a regular gardener, found a way into some education, got more education, got a job in the field, and then just really became more knowledgeable than a lot of the other people out there. And I have another video that talks about the best way to learn gardening. And what I say, the best way to learn gardening is to teach gardening to someone else. So if you're looking to really become a better gardener, well, start teaching someone else what you know right now. You don't have to be an expert. If you just know how to plant some seeds right now, then you already know more than someone that doesn't. So take that as a lesson. Start teaching people, teach your kids, teach your grandkids, teach your neighbors. It's a great way to learn, and that's my background. Okay, this goes to Orwa and Steve. I hope you're on today. We are kids watching from Canada and wondering if we should trim the lower branches of our cherry tomato plants. Thank you. Yes, probably. I have a video that, again, I've got videos on everything. I have a video on pruning tomatoes, and I strongly encourage that you prune off the bottom 12 to 18 inches of the branches. That greatly reduces disease problems and pest problems. Now wait until the plant is growing. So I would wait until the plant's about 3 feet tall before I prune off the bottom 12 inches. And then I would wait until the plant's about 4 feet tall before I prune off the bottom 18 inches. But definitely, I always do that. Prune off the bottom branches. So Orwa and Steve, great question. I definitely encourage that you do that. And also, if you haven't seen that video, it also talks about pruning the suckers and how you can control the height of your plant and the growth of your plant. So pruning tomatoes is important. Too many of us just let our tomatoes run rampant and they get crazy and take over the garden. But with some selective pruning, you really can keep them under control. Okay, Justin Ladvina, should you bubble worm tea in a bucket? And so, as far as teas go, you'll see a lot of information out there about worm tea, about compost tea, and there's some really extravagant methods where there's a bucket or there's a bin, and you put your compost in it, and you put the water in it, and you set up an aeration system, and it bubbles for 24 hours or 48 hours, and there's a lot of gardeners that do this. And if you do it, great. I don't think it's necessary. And the Garden Professor's website, they're professors out of the University of Washington. They also say through testing, it's unnecessary. The idea being that if you are putting worm castings or compost in water and then running the bubbles through it, aerating it, that you're encouraging the growth of aerobic bacteria, the bacteria that needs oxygen. And so the aerobic bacteria will grow and explode within that mix. And then when you put it on your soil, you have all of this good bacteria that the bubbling process helped propagate. Well, yes, there's some truth to that. If you put a bunch of compost and some molasses and you run bubbles through them, you'll have an explosion of aerobic bacteria. But once you put that tea in your soil, almost all of that bacteria is going to die because they're living in water that's been aerated, and now you pour them on soil where the surface is probably starting off as pretty dry, and that's not a condition that they can live in. So the way I look at it, a lot of that aeration is wasted effort because as soon as you put that liquid into your garden, the bacteria, which is the key piece of it, are gone. Their numbers are going to be greatly diminished. Now, some will survive and some can benefit the soil, but if you're doing what you should do in your garden and have organic material in your soil already, the bacteria is already there. And so by adding some of this new bacteria, yeah, you may increase the overall population. You might actually decrease some of the beneficial bacteria that you've been working so hard to grow in your soil. And now you're incorporating some of this other bacteria that came from your compost or came from your worms, and it may not be suitable for the biome within your soil with the natural bacteria that's already helping your plants. So I'm not a big fan of teas. I'm not a big fan of aerating teas. I would prefer to take the worm castings and mix them into my soil, especially my potting soil, and then let the naturally occurring bacteria populate based on that material. And then the same with compost. Put the compost in my soil as an amendment or on top of the soil as a mulch, and let all the naturally occurring bacteria populate that organic material. Okay, another question, and this kind of ties in, I mentioned this earlier. Russell Rodwanski, next year I hope to start doing my actual gardening. Do you have any tips for me to prepare for next year? I've got a hungry bin going for vermicomposting, and I'll be building some hugelkultur beds. And so like I just talked a couple minutes ago, I think this is great that you're thinking about next year and asking what you can do this year. That is the way I recommend gardening. And so as I suggested previously, to just go ahead and focus on your plants right now and then wait until the off season to put more beds in and to expand your garden, that's what I'm going to say to Russell as well. Do what you can this year. Get that hugelkultur bed built. Get other beds built. Get whatever you can done this year so that next year all of the structures are in place. That foundation is there. The soil has been amended. The bacteria is already in place. You've got mulches ready to go. Now when you put the seeds and the plants in, all you have to do is just focus on the plants. You really don't have to focus on the building. And I showed that in my video a couple weeks ago, reviewing the year that I had in the garden. I've spent a whole year building my garden. And I have a whole nother year where I'm going to be building the garden. I've really slowed down in my building while I'm taking care of the plants as much as possible. I'm going to ramp up again. At the end of fall and into next spring, I'll be doing more building. I'll be doing more construction. Take some time in your garden now to learn how to garden, to learn how to grow plants. Start building the beds, start planning what you're going to grow well in advance. And it's so much easier when the time comes for you to actually do it because you've had so much time. And especially if you're starting this year, looking to next year, educate yourself. Learn everything you can. Watch my videos, watch other videos, read blogs, teach someone else about gardening. Do all you can to get your knowledge base built up this year and the structures built up this year, and then put all that energy into your garden next year. So that's the way that I suggest you do it. Okay. Oh, yeah, thanks. Jay's answering the question, talking about deciduous branches and hugelkultur. Take a look at my hugelkultur. I get a lot of questions about that. Hugelkultur, it's a way of setting up a bed that a lot of Americans know nothing about. And I use deciduous branches. I use coniferous branches, the softwoods, the hardwoods, wood chips, leaves. The idea is that you put woody material, cover it with soil, and you plant in it. So a lot more information. Thanks for throwing that out there, Jay. Okay, let's get to another question. Paul Burke had asked, can you compost tomato plants? Because I've been told not to. Yes, but, so the reason you've heard not to compost tomato plants is that tomato plants are often infected by something. They're infected by a fungus, they're infected by a bacteria, they're infected by some insect pest, and you don't always know that or recognize that. And even if you do, you may not realize how serious it is. So the common recommendation is don't compost your tomato plants. Throw them away. Because if you take whatever that infection is and put it into your compost, now you're infecting your compost. And when you use that compost later in your garden, you're transferring that infection to another bed, potentially to your entire garden. So, if I know my plants are clean, if I know I don't have blight, if I don't have any of those other tomato diseases that are so rampant, then yes, I will compost my tomatoes. But if I notice anything starting to develop, particularly blight, that's probably the most common problem you're going to have, early blight or late blight, then don't compost the plants. I will cut them down and toss them in the trash because I don't want to infect my compost. That's the best way to look at it. The same with potatoes. You may have seen that you shouldn't use store-bought potatoes in compost for the same reason. The field that was growing those potatoes could have been infected. It could have gotten on the skin of the potato. Now you peel your potatoes and put your skins in the compost. You could be introducing some type of disease. So I typically, well, almost always, I don't put potato peelings in my compost from store-bought potatoes, and it depends on the tomato plant. Okay, let's see if we have any other questions. Lots of comments going back and forth. So Avin asked, how did you become so knowledgeable about gardening? I just answered that question a little bit while ago. There might have been a delay. You just got to get out there and do it. Just garden and learn what can go wrong and then do the analysis. So if something goes wrong in your garden, or especially if something goes right in your garden, then find out what it was that happened. What was it you did wrong and what was it that you did right? Watch the videos, read the books, follow the blogs, go to gardening classes like the ones that I've taught and will be teaching again in the future here in Colorado. Look into those kind of things and just continue to expand your knowledge. My knowledge has been building over 30 years. It's taken me 30 years to get to this point. And the last 7 years, I've been very focused on becoming as knowledgeable about gardening as I can be. And I still don't know a fraction of what the information is available that's out there. I still watch gardening videos and I still read gardening books. I'm still learning. So for me, gardening is a lifelong learning opportunity and experience. Okay, let's get to this one. And this ties into the same basic subject. PVC 9x1 was asking, what about composting rhubarb leaves? And so a lot of people grow rhubarb. I grow rhubarb. I think it's a great plant. You're told that you shouldn't eat the leaves because they're toxic. And I'm guessing that's why you're asking the question. Sure, you can put your rhubarb leaves in compost. I do it all the time. It's toxic if you ingest it. It might make you sick. It's not poisonous. You shouldn't eat a rhubarb leaf, but put it in the compost. It's going to break down pretty quickly, and the nutrients in that leaf will be dissipated throughout the compost. You don't have to worry about getting sick because you're not going to be eating the compost to start with. That compost is going to go into your soil, and those nutrients will benefit the plants. And the plants don't care about anything that's in the rhubarb leaves that's going to make them sick, because plants don't get sick. So compost your rhubarb leaves. It's definitely something that you should consider. Okay, let's take another look to see if there are any questions that popped up. Yeah, Project 100 says, if you haven't seen it already, look for Richard Hugh on YouTube. It used to be called Hugh's Garden. He's English, he's in Wales. He's much younger than me. I'm probably 3 times his age, but he has great content. And thank you for pointing that out, Project 100. I've said this in earlier videos and earlier live streams when I talk about educating yourself. You don't have to just find someone that looks like you and lives where you live to learn about gardening. Some of the best gardening channels out there come from England and Australia and regions of the United States that are far different than mine. But they all have great information. And especially with some of those English channels, Simplify Gardening is a great channel from my buddy Tony. And he and I are actually working on a video that we'll be doing together here in the weeks ahead. He's got great information. I love Tony's channel, Simplify Gardening. It's in England. Great information. So when you're looking to learn more, expand beyond where you're living and what you're growing, I'll watch videos from all over the world. They're growing a plant I know I can't grow, but their methods are methods that I can copy to grow my plants better. So there you have it. And that kind of leads us right into the philosophy moments of the day. So let's talk a little bit about philosophy. As we hit summer in the Northern Hemisphere and roll forward, the garden's growing great, the weather's warm, we're concerned about things like pests and water, but the point I want to raise today is stay positive, because this is the time of year when things start going wrong. If something's going to happen, it's going to happen now, right when the garden is growing so well. And I got a lot of comments. I had some, Derek in Canada, his garden was devastated by the hail. Tia from the UK was talking about how they had record heat, and then that moved into wind for weeks, and then rainy periods that won't end. I just had some hail this last week, and I lamented that a little bit in last night's video. This is a hard time of year. You're staying positive. Like I talked about last week, you have that vision, you have that dream, you know what you want your garden to look like, and then Mother Nature doesn't cooperate. And you might lose everything, especially if you're one of those Canadian gardeners who have had some terrible storms in recent weeks that have devastated your gardens. Well, as was pointed out by Derek, he's getting right back into it. Everything was destroyed, but he's planting more, putting more seeds in. And that's what I want you to do. Stay positive. Even when everything falls apart. My daughter had planted some tomato plants that I had given her. The hail was coming. They wanted to protect the plants. So what did they do? They covered them. Great idea. But in the haste of covering the bed with the tomato plants, they made a mistake. And this is a very common mistake. I don't want to point out my daughter's problem in particular, except to say they covered their plants without realizing that by doing that, they were causing damage to the plants. And so the hail didn't hit, but when they took the covers off of the potatoes or the tomatoes, they realized that they had actually broken off some of the growing tips of the tomatoes. In their effort to protect the plants, they actually harmed the plants. Well, that's a critical lesson to learn. And you don't learn that lesson until you do it yourself. Believe me, I know because I've done it myself. Those kind of things are going to happen at the height of the growing season. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to kill some plants. You're going to damage some plants. The weather may damage the plants. And especially if you're new at gardening, if you're just getting into this and you've had great success so far, and then something happens that just devastates everything you're doing, it is so easy to say, I'm done. I spent my time and my money and I built it and I was wanting it to be fun and now it's not. I quit. Don't quit. Push through it. You can do it. Stay positive. As I've said many times before, use this as an opportunity to learn. If something goes wrong, learn from it so that the next time a hailstorm comes, you're not so quick to cover the plants without putting up some type of structure that will hold the tarp off of the plants. Great idea to cover, but you don't want to break the plants. Now that you've learned it, it'll never happen again. Overwater and plant leaves yellow, maybe drop off. Well, now you learn to check the soil before you water. You get away from a steady schedule and you learn some proper methods. A pest comes to your garden and you can't control it, well, now you learn more about the pest. We started the day talking about the flea beetle. Well, when he asked his question, he didn't know that it was a flea beetle. But in the 10 minutes before we started this live stream, based on Scott jumping in and asking a few questions, he was able to look it up and realize he had flea beetles. That's exactly what I'm talking about. If you see something happening in your garden, and it's distressing for you, don't quit, don't lament. Instead, figure it out. Stay positive, deal with it, and move forward. You're going to have problems. You're going to have things go wrong. That's just the way gardening is. But, and I had a lot of people comment about this overnight, every day in the garden is a good day. If you're outside in your space, it's a good day. It doesn't matter if it's raining or hail and what the plants are doing. Yeah, it feels bad. I definitely feel for my plants, and it might be uncomfortable, but it's a day in the garden. It's a great day. So stay positive. Try to avoid focusing on the negative aspects of gardening. You can look at the negative aspects. You can analyze the negative aspects. but don't focus on the negative aspects to the point that you start thinking that it's too hard and you don't want to do it anymore. I think especially you new gardeners that have discovered this wonderful hobby during these terrible times we're going through right now, I think you've discovered something that can change your lives if you just stick with it. If you learn more and you keep trying and you press forward, you're going to find that it's wonderful. And then you get to the point like me where I've been doing this for 30 years, consider myself an expert, but still recognize that I make mistakes. There's still a lot to learn. I still go out to the garden and say, how did I allow that to happen? That's terrible. And then I stop and realize, nope, it's not terrible. It's a learning opportunity. And that's where the garden journal again comes in. Take your journal, write down your thoughts, write down your notes. Figure out what you need to do different for next year. It might be too late for this year. Sorry. But think about it for next year and definitely come back for next year. Order your bare root plants. Put your plan together. Build your structures. Get everything ready to go while the off season is happening, or even after this season has turned out to be so terrible. And then next year, reapproach it, do it better, and you're going to have a better result with your garden, and you're going to enjoy it so much more. So I like to stay positive. I like to dream about the garden. I really like to focus on the positive aspects because gardening is just so wonderful in so many ways. But the reality is, it's hard and things go wrong. Just don't let that get you down. Keep working, keep pushing, keep learning. And now when the results happen, it's even better. I was talking with my neighbor yesterday. We were both outside, he in his yard, I in mine. We were talking about the activities that we were doing, and he was telling me about some of this stuff. Their squash is doing better this year than it's ever done before, but they're having problems in other areas. Some of the plants that did do well in the past aren't doing so well right now. And in our conversation, what I brought up to him, and he completely agreed with, is it can be hard, especially when you're in a challenging environment. But when things do go right, oh man, it makes it all worthwhile. If you've had a bad year and you couldn't grow any tomatoes, the next year when you grow your tomatoes and they do well, guarantee you that first tomato that you harvest and eat will probably be the best tomato you've ever tasted because it took you 2 years to grow it. That's what gardening is all about. Savor those successes and enjoy the good moments so much that they completely overshadow those things that pop up and become annoyances. So there you have it. Stay positive, keep moving, keep gardening, keep doing it, and keep focusing on the positive. And you'll really learn to realize that gardening is just a wonderful activity and something that you need to encourage others to do, just like I'm encouraging you. There you have it, a few moments of philosophy for the day. So thank you so much as we're looking at the people rolling through. Diane is saying another good chat taught next week. Definitely. I see a few last minute questions popping up. I'll be sure and add them to the list from last week. Baby Root, thanks so much for this live stream. It's my first time on the live stream and look forward to more. Is this a weekly thing on Mondays? Yes, this is a weekly thing on Mondays. I try to do it every Monday. I did write in my notes, and I forgot to bring up that in 2 weeks, on July 6th, I will not be doing the live stream. My son and his family, including my new grandson, will be coming for a visit, and I won't be live on Monday, July 6th. That's in 2 weeks. Except for that Monday, yes, we're here every Monday. It depends on where you're at. It's 3 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. And so you can figure out what your variation is from Greenwich Mean Time. But 3 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time is when we start. We go for about 90 minutes, try to answer as much as I can answer, share my philosophy, talk about all the other wonderful things that are happening in the gardening world, in my garden in a week. So I hope to see you come back. If you can't see it here on the live stream, or if you miss a portion, it always comes out later in the day as a YouTube video on the Gardener Scott channel. So if you can't find the live stream, or you missed the live stream, or you miss a portion of the live stream, you can always come back and see it later as a video. CM Johns is saying, I've been journaling for 3 years. Definitely will learn what not to do for next year's and what works and what doesn't. LOL. Thanks for sharing that, because journaling is one of those things that really makes a difference in the success of your garden. Jay, thank you so much. Before the end, hit thumbs up to help Google find this. I appreciate that. And every week, Jay, you're such a big supporter. And I know that there are others that also say hit the thumbs up and other things. So thank you so much for that support. I do appreciate the thumbs up. I appreciate the comments. Believe it or not, Google looks at the comments and they can find my channel because of this interaction, because so many people are involved. We've got about 230 people that are on the chat right now. Lots of enthusiasm, not just from me, but from you. So I want to thank you all for the time you give me every Monday. I'll see you next Monday, but not the one after. And then I'll be back on July 13th. So next week, a week off, and July 13th. So get your questions ready. Get ready to share. Don't forget, I'm on Facebook as Gardener Scott as well. And so if you have something that is a little bit of a time crunch and you're looking for an answer and you can't wait a week, go ahead and seek me out on Facebook, because I usually check that once or twice a day as well. So good to see you. Hope you have a wonderful gardening week. I hope you have great success and that you share that success with anybody you can. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.